Psychologist Dr. Carl Jung said the world will ask you who you are, and if you don't know, the world will tell you. Which is why I'm out here in the Queensland outback being me, to avoid the fundamental contradiction of not being who we truly are. And I'm always going to be doing these talks from mountains or deserts, oceans or rivers and waterfalls, because there's a certain perfection there that just can't be imitated. Which is why I'm down here at this beautiful outback lake thinking about doing a talk on melatonin. Everybody knows it's the sleep hormone, yet what we sometimes forget is, according to science, it's been around for 3 billion years because it was created originally by bacteria and then it got assimilated into what we call eukaryote cells, which then went on and became plants and animals and fungi. And in that 3 billion years, melatonin remains completely unchanged in structure. So something got developed 3 billion years ago which does not need any refining or improvement and continues to perform miraculous functions. I'm starting to find that very hard to believe that it came together by accident in an amorphous collection of sea minerals in an ocean of goop. And it would seem to me that it makes much more sense that if something was created 3 billion years ago, which continues to work miraculously, that it was perhaps created rather than an accident. But we'll talk about more of that later. Kind of the same as the mitochondria, where I talked about last week, where the mitochondria, which were created from bacteria, according to science, when one bacteria engulfed another bacteria in what's called endosymbiosis, and that bacteria that was engulfed went on to become the mitochondria. And these mitochondria, we know, as we discussed last week, use quantum physics with quantum tunneling and quantum entanglement in order to move the electrons through the electron transport chain fast enough for us to create our energy. But before I continue, I've got to get out the medical disclaimer, because I continue, after over 6 years, to be suspended in nutritional environmental medicine, and I am only allowed to practice as an emergency specialist in a public hospital. So none, and I repeat none with a capital N-O, of what I talk about is medical or health advice. I do it purely for your educational and entertainment purposes. And because I'm not very entertaining, I do these films in these beautiful areas to keep you entertained. And remember that none of this information replaces consultation with your own medical or health advisor, whom you should consult if you have any questions about anything I say on these videos. And finally, I want to say that just because I am a crazy Viking Kiwi who likes jumping in glacial mountain pools does not mean anybody else should do it without adequate training in the hormetic principles of hot and cold therapy. So I'll put up the health disclaimer now. And there's also one in the information part of the YouTube video that you should read. Let me see if I can do any walking here tonight. Uh-oh, too much rain. You've seen that's where I've been walking before, but now covered in water. Nonetheless, it's a beautiful view. Before I start talking about melatonin and its myriad of effects. Unfortunately, and some of you might just want to skip this, we have to go back to the whiteboard, because I really think it's important that we have an understanding of how melatonin interacts with the mitochondria, because that's the key to all of its beneficial effects. So I'm going to take us quickly to the whiteboard, and then we'll be back, maybe at a rainforest, to continue this talk. Right, there's the summary of what we're talking about today. Now, if you want to miss the science and the whiteboard teaching, just skip towards the end, where the take-home message will be that sunlight during the day is good, don't get burnt, and light at night is bad because it suppresses melatonin function, and melatonin is a 3 billion year old molecule with miraculous effects in the body, including sleep, but also particularly in the prevention of cancer. So last week we looked at how glucose and sunlight provide electrons to pass through the electron transport chain to produce heat, light, energy is ATP, water, and exhaust is free radicals and carbon dioxide. Now, exhaust doesn't sound very good. But in fact, sometimes this exhaust is necessary because it produces free radicals, which our immune system uses to kill bugs, also produces carbon dioxide, which has the important function of stimulating us to breathe, also production of bicarbonate, which the body uses to alkalize itself. But today, we're not going to focus on this part, we're going to focus on this part of glucose going to the cell to form pyruvate and then becoming melatonin, where 95% of the body's melatonin comes from production in the mitochondria, whereas 5% comes from production in the pineal gland. Okay, so that's all you have to remember. Let's quickly do a quick summary of it so we can understand exactly what happens for pyruvate to get into the mitochondria to be able to produce lots of ATP for us. So first what happens is food gets converted to glucose. Glucose then gets converted to pyruvate. The dotted line here is the outer mitochondrial wall. So pyruvate goes from inside the cell through the mitochondrial outer membrane into the mitochondria, where it gets converted to acetyl-CoA, and then it goes through oxidative phosphorylation, which is what we looked at a couple of weeks ago, where the acetyl-CoA goes through the electron transport chain in the mitochondria to produce lots of ATP. In fact, it produces 32 ATP via that pathway. So in summary, food broken down to glucose. Glucose gets broken down to pyruvate, which moves through the wall of the mitochondria into the mitochondria, where it gets converted to acetyl-CoA, goes through oxidative phosphorylation to produce 32 ATP, lots of energy for us. Now, if pyruvate can't get into the mitochondria, it then gets converted to lactate, which tumor cells like, and we only produce ATP by a different pathway of energy production, which cancer cells also like. So food to glucose to pyruvate. Pyruvate can't get into the mitochondria, so instead, to produce some energy for us, it gets converted to lactate and to ATP. Now, for pyruvate to get through the wall of the mitochondria, it needs pyruvate dehydrogenase, an enzyme. So pyruvate dehydrogenase is the enzyme which allows pyruvate to enter through the outer mitochondrial membrane into the mitochondria to be metabolized to produce lots of ATP. Now, pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase inhibits the movement of pyruvate into the mitochondria, therefore forcing the cells to go into this pathway to produce energy rather than this pathway. What increases pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase? Hypoxia. Low oxygen environments increase PDK, therefore making us go this pathway to produce lactate and a few ATP. What inhibits pyruvate dehydrogenase guidase is melatonin. So melatonin, the 2 billion year old hormone, unchanged in 2 billion years, inhibits pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase, stopping the conversion of pyruvate to lactate and instead allowing pyruvate to go on to oxidative phosphorylation to produce lots of ATP for us. Let's have a look at how sunlight sets our circadian rhythm and our peripheral clocks that every cell in the body has, and also how it produces melatonin. So let's quickly summarize this diagram, which is really the 5 circles of how sunlight sets our peripheral clocks or causes the release of melatonin. So light from the sun hits the retina on the back of the eye and it stimulates melanopsin producing retinal ganglion cells, MPRGCs. They, via DHA, which is one of the famous omega-3 fatty acids largely from seafood, along with EPA is more cardiac in function, DHA is more brain, and DHA converts, and this is an incredible miracle, converts a light signal into a chemical signal, which then stimulates the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus area of our brain. And that is where our central clock is. And that sets our circadian rhythm and the timing of all of our bodily functions. And that communicates with our peripheral clocks, because every cell in our body has its own clock, but that is largely set by the central clock in the brain. Now, if this doesn't happen, if there's no sunlight, i.e. it's nighttime, no stimulation of the eye, no stimulation of the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So instead what happens is the body, because there's no light at night, releases a truckload of melatonin, mainly into the cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain and the spinal cord, which then does all the magical things that melatonin does. Remember, melatonin, as well as being released from the pineal gland, in fact only 5% of the body's melatonin production comes from the pineal gland, 95% acts locally by production in the mitochondria. So in summary, at night, no sunlight hits the eye because there's no light, no stimulation in the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So instead, we get a dumping of melatonin from the pineal gland into the cerebrospinal fluid, which does all its magic in the brain. Just remember though that 95% of melatonin in the body is not produced in the pineal gland, only 5% is. 95% is produced in our mitochondria of our cells. So the pineal gland melatonin is largely to do with the circadian rhythm, whereas the mitochondrial melatonin, 95% of our body's melatonin produced locally in the mitochondria, which is what we're going to discuss today, the local effects of melatonin apart. Thank goodness that's over and I can get back outside. So what we're going to do now, quickly, is talk about the origin of melatonin. We're going to talk about its role in the body, and then we're going to focus a little bit more on its role in, better make sure I don't fall in the lake, its role in the prevention and perhaps the treatment of cancer. So where did melatonin come from? Well, we've kind of alluded to that. Science says that it developed in bacteria 3 billion years ago. And then when bacteria underwent an endosymbiosis event to produce organisms which contain mitochondria, or in plants they're called chloroplasts, that was 2 billion years ago. And basically melatonin has remained completely structurally the same for the last 2 billion years. When you make something that perfect, when something that perfect is created, you generally hold on to it. And it's made in the human body in the pineal gland, where 5% is made, and in our mitochondria, where it makes 95% of our melatonin. Plants make it in their chloroplasts, largely using that melatonin to protect them from UV light. And we first discovered melatonin in 1958 and worked out that our mitochondria make it from acetyl-CoA and serotonin, which both have to be able to get into the mitochondria to be able to make the melatonin. Now what I'm going to do is, as I talk about some of the science, I'm going to put in some quotes from the scientific studies which I'm getting the information from, and I'll put on screenshots of the scientific papers so you guys can go and access those same scientific papers if you'd like to. Okay, now let's have a look at the functions of mitochondria in the body, and because I'm not that smart, I need to make myself some mnemonics to help me remember. And how I remember the function of melatonin is the mnemonic CIAM. C stands for circadian rhythm. So we all know that melatonin puts us to sleep at night, and during the day there's very little melatonin released from the pineal gland, although, as we've said, our mitochondria continue to make it locally inside the cells. C also stands for cancer, because melatonin helps reduce the risk of cancer, and we're going to talk about that in chapter 3 today. Also stands for cardiac, because melatonin is very good for the heart, helps reduce inflammation in the heart and improve cardiac function. I is for insulin, because melatonin reduces insulin levels, reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes. And of course the corollary of that, that's a good word, isn't it? Corollary. I never use that. The other word I like, let me get sidetracked for a second, which is relevant today, is a word a good friend of mine from Alaska taught me, which is petrichor. Petrichor is the word for the beautiful smell that you get in dirt after fresh rain. Comes from the Greek word for stone and blood. Right, where was I? Reducing the risk of type 2 diabetes. Then we've got A. A is for antioxidant, and we're going to come back and briefly talk a little bit more about its role as an antioxidant, because that's very important. Because you remember we've discussed how mitochondria produce a lot of pollution. When you produce pollution, although we need that pollution from the carbon dioxide and the free radicals, we also have to protect ourselves from it. A is also because melatonin helps increase the ATP production from the mitochondria to give us more energy. And finally, M. Now M's kind of interesting, because I didn't really know about M until I did some research on it. First one of M is menopause, and second one is menstruation, because it turns out the melatonin is particularly important for regulation of female menstruation, keeping the periods regular. Also very important in deciding, oh spiderweb, when menopause happens and how smoothly the menopause process is. So you can imagine what happens to menstrual cycle and menopause when we're turning off our melatonin at night by exposing ourselves to artificial light. And finally, the last one, of course, is mitochondria, where melatonin is produced, and it's produced inside the mitochondria for a reason, because it helps keep their metabolism normal, which is very relevant when we're going to come on and talk about its role in cancer, because cancer cells change their metabolism from our normal oxidative phosphorylation production of 32 ATP to what's called the Warburg effect, where they use the anaerobic method of metabolism despite the presence of lots of oxygen, because they favor that metabolism for two reasons. One, it can produce energy much faster than oxidative phosphorylation. Even though it doesn't make as much ATP, the system works faster and they need fast energy to fuel their rapid growth. And also it produces a lot of lactate, and lactate changes the microenvironment into a environment which cancer cells can more easily spread and metastasize. So we're going to talk about that in a second. The other role that melatonin has in the mitochondria is that, along with the other magic M, magnesium, it reduces progressive calcification of the mitochondria, which start to impair their function. One of the reasons I've embraced cold thermogenesis, getting in cold water, is that sure, it gives me a vascular benefit. I get the dilation and constriction of my blood vessels to keep them healthy. It also increases the number of mitochondria I've got, called mitogenesis, because science shows that mitochondria heat up to 50 degrees Celsius when we get cold to heat us up, and they also divide to create more mitochondria under the spider web. So I'm making more mitochondria and they're much healthier because the calcium, and remember, as we age and parts of our body get more inflamed, starts to calcify, and melatonin helps reduce the calcification of the mitochondria. Now, the other thing that they do in the mitochondria, because the mitochondria are like the car engine, fuel goes in, out comes energy, but also, as we said, also out comes pollution. The pollution from the mitochondria is in the form of carbon dioxide, which is not really pollution in some ways because it stimulates us to breathe, produces bicarbonate, has multiple other beneficial effects in the body, and also produces oxygen-free radicals, oxygen with an extra electron on it. So just like a car engine, mitochondria have to protect themselves from that pollution. Because yeah, we want some free radicals. We use those oxygen molecules with an extra electron on it to help kill microbes, but we also have to protect ourselves from excessive production of those free radicals. How does a car do it? A car does it because they incorporate heat shields, they have catalytic converters which convert the exhaust to less harmful substances. They've got oil which lubricates and cools the engine, and they've got an exhaust system which takes the exhaust out of the car. So we have the same system. Its name is melatonin, which does the same thing for our mitochondria. Okay, last chapter, chapter 3. Let's have a look at melatonin and cancer, and then we'll conclude with what I do to try and keep my melatonin levels optimal. So what's the Warburg effect? Well, we learned on the whiteboard, the infamous whiteboard, that normal cells take glucose, pass it into the cell as pyruvate. Pyruvate goes through a process of what's called oxidative phosphorylation to make 32 ATP per glucose molecule. Now that process requires oxygen as the terminal electron acceptor, as the electrons pass through the 5 respiratory proteins. Now if we don't have enough oxygen, called hypoxia, then our cells use the anaerobic system where the glucose, instead of going into the cells as pyruvate, where the pyruvate, instead of being converted to acetyl-CoA, actually gets converted to lactate, which can happen without the use of oxygen. The problem is we only make 2 ATP per glucose molecule that way versus 32 via oxidative phosphorylation. Now cancer cells use that same metabolism called the Warburg effect, despite the presence of lots of oxygen. because they prefer using that metabolism. You go, well, why does cancer want to produce only 2 ATP rather than 36? Well, it seems to be the answer. Well, the answer seems to be that the Warburg effect, the production of ATP via the lactate pathway, produces energy a lot faster, and the cancer needs energy fast to sustain its rapid growth. The other benefit the cancer cells get by the Warburg effect is that they get used to operating optimally in a hypoxic environment, which occurs sometimes when they have rapid growth to areas where there's not a great blood supply yet. And also the lactate kind of acidifies their microenvironment, and cancer seems to like an acidic microenvironment to to support their rapid spread locally and also their metastases. So in summary, cancer prefers not to use oxidative phosphorylation, but changes the cell's metabolism to the Warburg effect to produce ATP via the anaerobic pathway, despite there being lots of oxygen around, to help support their growth and metastasis. And remember, we found that for cancer cells to do that, they use pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase to inhibit the use of pyruvate in the mitochondria. And melatonin, this is where it gets really cool, melatonin inhibits the pyruvate dehydrogenase kinase, stopping the cancer cells from using the Warburg effect, because the cells can still use pyruvate and oxidative phosphorylation. So in summary, melatonin prevents cancer cells using their optimum form of metabolism and energy production. So what happens at night when we've got lots of melatonin in our bodies? Well, that happens. So what's really interesting is science has shown that cancer cells use the Warburg effect during the day when there's not much melatonin around, but they use normal metabolism at night when there's lots of melatonin around. I've had to stop walking because I was getting assaulted by too many flies, so I'm going to hide in the shade for a while. Okay, so that's pretty much the science finished. So chapter 3 is really about how I use that information to try and stay as healthy as possible. Of course, this is not medical advice, just what I do. So we know that cancer cells are not cancer cells, or don't have a cancer cell metabolism at night when there's lots of melatonin around. And we know that most of the melatonin released at night comes from the pineal gland. The problem is during the day, when there's no melatonin being released from the pineal gland, only from the mitochondria, and cancer cells revert back into the cancer cell metabolism. So the research has shown that taking melatonin, and that research is very early, does have some role to play in cancer treatment and prevention. One of the problems is that we don't really know about the dosing, because most people will produce about 0.3 milligrams of melatonin during the whole day, and now we're taking 5, 10, 20, 30 milligrams or even higher milligrams of melatonin to try and get a therapeutic effect. But as you've seen, this is 2 billion years of melatonin perfecting its role in the body. And there's so many factors involved and so much fine tuning that we rely on our body that's been created to fine tune that system. That it's very hard to come along and just go in with a giant bat with a massive dose of melatonin and expect incredible results. So for me, it's about trying to maximize my own production. So how do I do that? Well, during the night, that's easy, because we know that any kind of artificial light at night, other than perhaps low level red light and infrared light, will switch off melatonin production. So at night, I've got my circadian lighting and I've got a red and infrared light. If I do have to turn the lights on or anything, or I'm at work, because I do shift work, which is incredibly high risk. Shift workers, we know, have a very high incidence of cancer, dramatically lower life expectancy than non-shift workers, including emergency physicians, which I'm one of now. So at night, if I have to do anything, I'll wear my blue light blocking glasses. So the question is, and then I've got my own melatonin doing its job. The question is, what am I going to do during the day when I'm exposed to artificial light, or I'm not producing my own pineal gland melatonin? Well, we do know now that our mitochondria make melatonin to protect themselves against what we've just been discussing. My goal is to maximize my own mitochondrial production of melatonin by keeping my melatonin as healthy as possible. So how do I do that? Well, that'll be for another video, but some quick easy ones that I do to keep my mitochondria healthy is I get some sun during the day, because mitochondria like sunlight. I get in cold water most days, because the cold water heats up my mitochondria to 50 degrees. It brings my respiratory proteins closer together in my mitochondria, and it induces mitogenesis and making more mitochondria, particularly in my fat, and converting my white fat to brown fat. And I also take magnesium, which is required not only for optimal mitochondrial function, but also for the activation of vitamin D, so I get the benefit of my vitamin D in all its functions. So in summary, at night, I'll reduce my exposure to light at night. If I do need light at night, it'll be red or infrared light. If I need to turn the lights on, I'll put on my blue light blocking glasses. During the day, I'll make sure that even if I'm inside, I'll try getting outside at least for a couple of minutes every hour to get some light on my eyes. I take my magnesium, and I do my cold thermogenesis. So that's a good easy start for me to try and maximize my own melatonin production from my mitochondria, so they're acting as antioxidants to protect the mitochondria from damage, and also optimizing my immune system, which is what we talked about, where we're using our macrophages to destroy cancer cells before they get a chance to grow, and before they hijack our macrophages and start using them themselves by injecting through microtubules their own mutated DNA into our macrophages. So if you haven't seen that video, it was a couple of videos ago about how cancer uses our macrophages for their own benefit. Okay, that's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed that. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, because I've got some really exciting stuff coming up. Later this year, I'm be traveling through the US and Europe and India, and I'll be interviewing lots of people who are very active in this kind of health strategies in some very amazing locations. So stay around for that. And one of those places will be India. And I was reading this really interesting Indian philosophy the other day, which basically says that if you leave home in the morning and you get lost, but at the end of the day you find yourself back at home, you were never really lost, you were always on your way home. And that's kind of how I feel things have turned out for me, because as you know, I was in a very dark place for a long period of time, lost, got immersed in a fundamental contradiction where I could no longer be who I truly am. And in fact, I'm going to do a video soon about the two major issues I think the world's facing at the moment. One is that the fundamental contradiction that a lot of us are lost in terms of the fundamental contradiction, not able to be who we truly are. And the second, so separation from our true selves, and also separation from a spiritual philosophy. And as I've said before, the deeper I go into science, the more I study quantum effects, quantum physics, mitochondria, melatonin, vitamin D, the more convinced I become that this wasn't all just an accident, that there was an intelligent design behind this. And I really think that having a spiritual basis to one's life really keeps you grounded and not separated from source, which I think is incredibly important. But I'll talk about that more in other videos. Until then, always remember that no matter how much it hurts, how dark it gets, or how far you fall, you are never out of the fight. Don't give up. Thanks for watching. Love you all. Peace and love. See you next time. Bye.
Boring old office just won't do. So we found a mountain waterfall for